Hello and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, not quite evening, but coast to coast, we're really happy that you're able to join us here today. My name is Randy Engstrom, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you all to the Cultural Policy Action Lab, a national professional development program supported by grant makers in the arts. And I'm going to turn my email sound off and hand it over to my friend Jen for the next slide.
Sorry, everyone, technical difficulties. Hello, everyone. I'm Jen Cole, and I'm currently the Dean of the Pacific Northwest College of Art here in Portland, Oregon, and I'm also happy to welcome you here.
And never a dull moment in the Zoomosphere world of emergent technology. My name is Randy Engstrom. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the co-founder and principal of Third Way Creative, a collaborative consulting studio based in Seattle, Washington.
Hi there, my name is Estrella Esquiling, and I am calling in from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm the residency director at the Santa Fe Art Institute, and I'm retreating to backstage. I will be monitoring the chat. As you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, as well as the chat if you'd like. Q&A will be seen by all panelists. We will be filtering the questions and presenting them at the final portion of the session. If you have a pressing question, you can feel free to put it in the chat. It's not going to be guaranteed to be answered, but we'd love to get through all of your questions as you have them. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Cole. I use she, her pronouns. And I am currently the Dean of the Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland, Oregon. We on the next slide? Yeah. Sorry, everyone, we're a little technical difficulty. We're really thrilled to welcome you today to the Cultural Policy Action Lab. The Cultural Policy Action Lab learning series, which you are a part of, and we're in session 1, is actually a collective initiative led by grant makers in the arts to expand the cultural opportunities and leadership opportunities for those working in the public sector to advance public policy, racially equitable public policy in the arts. The lab has 3 components. One is a national learning cohort of members, which we'll talk about in a second, who've been selected from state and local arts agencies around the United States who seek to work together in a learning cohort to advance policy solutions that are grounded in racial equity. The second is actually this series that you're in now, which is a free public open access series trying to sort of look at questions and segments of public policy in the United States and how arts culture can advance racial equity. I'd like to talk a little bit about the cohort members. So these individuals apply through a national review process, and each of them are working together in a learning series alongside of this national public conversation that we're having today to really deepen their practice as cultural policy leaders in their states and municipalities. Andy?
And so this program, both the cohort and the National Learning Series, was co-designed with a bunch of really brilliant people, some of whom you'll hear from today. And we're really honored to have shared space and to be able to co-create with all these folks. Roberta Bedoya from the City of Oakland, Pam Bro from NASA, Cezanne Charles from Root of Two, David Holland from West Staff, Amanda Mallory and Johanna from Care Lab, Claire Rice from Illinois Arts Alliance, Kristen Sakota from the LA Department of Arts and Culture, and Tariana Navas Nieves from City and County of Denver. This was a team effort. We couldn't have done it without GIA support and leadership, and we couldn't have done it without the brilliant contribution of these folks. So know that while this is work that we're very proud of, it's also shared work with all of these great people.
We'd also like to, before we begin today, sort of acknowledge our Indigenous land and where we are from. We are coming in from land owned and land back to Indigenous peoples. We're going to be putting those in the chat. And we would encourage you to also acknowledge where you are coming from and turn it over to Randy to sort of talk about moving from acknowledgement to practice.
Yeah, we thought that it was really important. I mean, land acknowledgement is important. Acknowledging the traditional lands that we exist on is important, but we really want, in the spirit of action, to see this become more tangible. And so we're putting some links in the chat. You'll see Native Women Lead, NVN Collective, First Peoples Fund, a number of Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. If you can, if you're able, we encourage you not just to acknowledge, but to put your resources and your energy behind these efforts to invest in Native leadership. And we hope that that can help to redress some of the historical harms that have occurred.
While we're starting today, we know there's a lot of folks in the chat, but we would really love to know kind of where you're coming from, what agency you're coming from, what organization you're coming from, sort of who are you as you enter into this room, who are you bringing with you? That would help us understand the folks that are coming together really to think about arts, culture, and racially equitable public policy. So if you wouldn't mind adding those into the chat as they come to you or as you acknowledge yourself in this space, I think that would be a learning moment for all of us.
Thank you, Jen. So why did Grantmakers in the Arts invest in this work, and why is it a priority for the organization? And this is a conversation that's been ongoing with the staff and the board for a number of years. But one, and I think sort of the primary reason is Grantmakers in the Arts has had and has lived a commitment to racial equity for the last decade or so, led by Justin Lang, Maureen Knight, and Denise Brown, Janet Brown, many folks who came before. GIA has been committed to systemic and structural change towards racial equity and racial justice. This program is an exploration of how public policy can advance that racial equity commitment that GIA has. Also, while 15 or 20 years ago, public sector members were not part of the GIA universe, they now represent fully 50% of GIA's membership. And as such, we know as practitioners that there are precious few spaces to develop our skills and to network and build a community of practice. And GIA seeks to provide that support to its members. So we are hoping this can be a useful tool, both for GIA's public sector members and for others who want to better understand public policy and how it might advance racial equity. Another issue is that a year ago, and Jen will talk about this report later in our presentation, GIA commissioned a study called Opportunities at the Intersection. And GIA has long been, particularly under Eddie Torres's leadership, with Nadia Lopta's leadership as well, interested in the intersection of cultural policy and other areas, other sectors, other areas of public policy and public life. And so this work is both to advance racial equity and also to advance intersectional practice. And finally, as an organization, GIA is really interested in being more aggressive in the policy and advocacy space because we have precious few sort of networks and membership organizations that can do that work in this country. Finally, I'll just say that the last 2 years have really amplified the need around this work with the pandemic and the effect that it's had on the public sector in particular, and also the opportunities that it's presented to reframe the way that cultural policy and the cultural sector coexists within the public sector.
So over the next 8 weeks, we'll be presenting these public conversations to sort of dig in deeper to arts and culture policy. But one of the things that we really want to talk about is as we center this work, and we hope that you'll join us for some or all of these presentations. We want to start with sort of how we center our belief in public policy. We start coming from a place of understanding that arts and culture policy in particular, and public policy writ large, in this country has not been holistic. It has not centered BIPOC people and their community well-being and their sense of narrative and belonging. And we believe that policy has the capacity to be far more just than it has been. We believe also that work of interrupting the systems of the harmful and racist systems of public policy and arts and culture policy in particular, that work is held and managed by people like you, people who are working, existing within the public sector, and that by building communities of practice and training networks of artists and civic leaders and change makers to facilitate self-determination and implement new change, that's actually how transformation occurs. And so we believe this work is a work of collective work together and collective imagination. And we want to center that work in the idea that this is about power shifting and power enabling amongst people like all of us who've joined today to sort of learn and advance together.
Thanks, Jen. And I think core to GIA's racial equity commitment is the movement of power and resources towards Alana communities or BIPOC communities or communities of color. And so I think that the vision that we have is that public policy can be a vehicle to do that as well. So we start by just clarifying what is public policy. And it's essentially anything the government chooses to do or not to do, and then codifies that decision. It is important to know these are political decisions. They are not based on any sort of empirical reality. They are sometimes regulatory, like you can't drink till you're 21, or redlining. And they are sometimes redistributive, like we're gonna collect taxes and we're gonna create a social safety net. But these are all a series of choices that the public sector makes. And as such, we wanna work towards a world wherein the choices that are made in the public sector about public policy reflect our values and bend towards justice. So public policy and racial equity, why is it important to address racial equity in the context of public policy in this country? Well, it's because here on the screen, you'll see a few examples of public policy that were executed in this country that had pretty disastrous outcomes. So obviously Indigenous genocide, chattel slavery, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese communities, redlining, which in some cases still exists to this day through banking practices. And the reason that we think public policy is an important tool to work towards racial equity and racial justice and more equitable systems generally is because public policy has been complicit in the outcomes that we see today. It has privileged certain communities over others, and it has extracted resources from communities to the benefit of others. And we want to work to, again, remediate that impact and build more just systems of public policy that have more equitable outcomes. So, cultural policy in America. This is very brief, and this is by no means a comprehensive walk through the history of cultural policy, but we wanted to give a little bit of a frame of what we mean when we say public policy or cultural policy in this country. So prior to the time we know now and the genesis of the NEA, in the 1930s, we had a couple of programs like muralists installing work on post offices as they were built across the country. But I think the largest nationalized program of cultural policy and cultural investment pre-1960s was the Works Progress Administration, a function of the New Deal. Many folks have heard about it. It's particularly come up a lot in the context of pandemic relief and pandemic response. But this was a program whereby the federal government invested directly in cultural producers, artists, and cultural organizations to mitigate the impacts and effects of the Great Depression, to help communities heal, to help communities foster belonging and social cohesion. And it was across all disciplines, and it was across the entire country. It was a pretty progressive and comprehensive model. It only lasted for a few years, but it was sort of the first cultural policy that was nationalized. In the 1960s, during the Johnson administration, the Great Society, the Civil Rights Act, that was when the National Endowment for the Arts was chartered in 1965. That began the birth of the local arts agency movement, whereby government at the national, state, regional, county, and city level was investing directly in arts and culture. First through grant making, that was sort of the most prominent function of local arts agencies in the 1960s. In the 70s, we saw the emergence of 1% for Art or public art programs, first in Baltimore, then in Seattle and a few other cities in the early 1970s. We saw cities take stewardship of cultural facilities and operate different theaters and performing arts spaces. We also saw the development of community festivals as a way to sort of foster community identity and a way to celebrate the uniqueness of place. And in the late 1970s, we saw the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, CETA, which is actually a bit of a throwback to the WPA and a little bit of a precursor to some of the creative economy policy that's being developed today at the federal level. So we saw really a broadening of cultural policy, largely through the local arts agency network, which is now well over 1,000 agencies. At every state, most counties and most cities have some form of a local arts agency that does some combination of these activities. In the 2000s, we saw the emergence of arts education as a focus for local arts agencies, largely because of the removal of arts education from primary and secondary education. We saw a commitment first to diversity, then to inclusion, then to equity, but the diversification and the recognition that the cultural sector favored the white Western canon to the exclusion of other forms became more apparent. It started with audience diversification, then board diversification, and now I think it's diversification of the means of cultural production. And it's really more of an exploration of equity. And then I think in the last decade, we've really seen with Art Place and Our Town, the rise of creative placemaking, and then the shout out to Roberto Bedoya, placekeeping, the idea that culture was always there, and maybe it's not creating a new culture there, but it's investing in and strengthening the cultural infrastructure in communities that exist today. And then finally, the creative economy, which has been around for a while, but we've seen that the creative industries in this country represent one of the largest and fastest growing segments of the national economy, and creativity is central to the skills necessary to function in that space. So creative economy has become sort of a large area of focus as well. And then obviously we saw a huge proliferation of cultural policy interventions over the past 2 years in the pandemic, many throwing back to the WPA days, California Creative Corps, Creatives Rebuild New York. We're going to hear about some really innovative models today of work that people have been doing over the last several years. But this is, in a nutshell, sort of all the ways in which we've had cultural policy formalized from government to support their communities in different ways and at different levels.
And so what actually has occurred is, over the last 100 years, really in this country, a solidification of some fairly commonly used policy domains and structures that exist within arts and culture, that where policy is exercised, right? Where resources are allocated, systems and structures are reinforced, and certain things are held in place through these mechanisms that many of you work in every single day. And most of us understand that underneath all of them, we've sort of built a system and a structure that holds certain pieces in place, and that certain things have become codified. And so one of the things we will seek to do in this learning series is to think about these mechanisms, how they came to be, what's possible if we apply a new imagination to them, and how we sort of deconstruct and reconstruct them in a way that is more equitable and centers justice. Randy, you have to add something?
Yeah, and so I think this is just a sense of what we're going to do over the next several months. Every other Wednesday between now and mid-September, we're going to take a deep dive in partnership with some brilliant co-presenters, starting in a couple of weeks with Grantmakers in the Arts and the National Association of State Arts Agencies. And we're going to explore how have these historically functioned, and how might they be more equitable in the future. So grants and other public investment will be the focus of the next module. Placemaking, placekeeping, and infrastructure will follow in the module 4 weeks from now. Public art and activation with our friends at Forecast Public Art will be the third session that we hold. I should say Cezanne Charles from Root of Two and David Holland from West Staff will be our guides for the placemaking and placekeeping module. Our friends at Creative Generation will help us explore the world of arts education. Claire Rice and her colleagues at the state of Illinois will talk about creative workforce development. And our good friends at Care Labs, other co-designers, will talk about first individual artist support, which is kind of an emergent practice of centering individuals versus institutions. And then the sort of progressive end of that artist support, which is artists in residence, cultural strategists, and some of the ways in which artists have been deployed directly by government to solve intersectional challenges.
Some of the underlying threads that we'll explore, and we'll talk about this as the session evolves, is that a lot of these tools have actually deployed tax-based resources that come from taxes that are generated by everyday residents and citizens, and redeployed them to support a certain type of cultural production, cultural facilitation, or cultural institution. And it's contingent upon us as leaders and organizers to ask questions: is how is that actually making communities and individuals whole? And is the way in which power and resource allocation and sort of structures related to that really reinforcing a holistic sense of who we might be as a country? A lot of this was explored more explicitly in some work that GIA commissioned and that I was the lead researcher on, along with Rebecca Kinslow from Oklahoma, around the possibility of the public sector. So Grantmakers in the Arts for many, many years really was centered in sort of the nonprofit and foundation-related space in terms of investments in arts and culture and sort of how they were advancing racial equity and justice. And in 2019, literally months before the pandemic kicked off in the United States, GIA did a call for proposals really to think about what the capacity was as a public sector to do racial justice work more effectively, particularly racial justice work anchored in arts and culture. This report took us about a year to complete, and was and I think Estrella is putting a link to the report in the chat. But we did a comprehensive literature review of hundreds of documents pertaining to sort of public policy in the public sector and arts and culture in particular, and then did targeted interviews around the country, really looking at a snapshot of possibility. And I want to sort of talk about three kind of overarching opportunities that we identified around why the public sector is an important place to try to intervene. So I think we first have to acknowledge that the public sector has held and facilitated much racially based harm in this country. And so it's pretty easy to sort of say, we have to work outside of that system. Public policy and the public sector have no place in advancing justice. And I can understand that sort of rationale very, very deeply. But I think it's important to acknowledge that although this has been a harmful space, it also is a space of specific and intentional opportunity. Right now in the United States, there's approximately 5 times the amount of dollars potentially going to the arts, both in the federal government, state and local governments, than there are actually in foundation coffers in the United States. So the idea that the discretionary capital and allocated capital in the public sector far exceeds the amount that we actually have in foundation. And so just from a power standpoint, it's important for us to not walk away from the public sector as a driver potentially of less harmful change. The other 3 things I want to sort of talk about, which are drilled down to more in the report, are the core macroeconomic conditions that exist in the public sector and why it's important. So one is that as we know in this country, have an exceedingly large amount of income inequality. And one of the things that is done is put an extraordinary amount of pressure on the public sector to provide services to individuals, as well as a shrinking tax base in order to do that. So the public sector is right now both a high demand sector and a sort of smaller resource sector. That kind of focus on the macroeconomic conditions in which the public sector needs to do its job also creates space for them to think about new ways to deliver and do work. And public policy, I think it creates an opportunity space for people to be more innovative about how they think about arts and culture because of the financial realities that are currently existing, particularly at state and localities related to the public sector. The second lever we identified is the messy space in which the public believes or doesn't believe about government to do work. So we have an all-time low, according to Pew Charitable Research, about trust in democratic institutions, particularly at the federal level. We have an all-time low of just only 17% of Americans actually believe that the federal government is actually going to do its job. We have a higher level of trust in local institutions and local leaders and officials. And so what we do have is some of those same studies by Pew indicate that Americans really, really, really want to believe in the power of democratic institutions. They believe fundamentally in the idea that we can and should be more fair, but there's a trust gap in the actual structures and institutions. So we have both economic conditions forcing the government to be different because it has a high demand to deliver services and lower resources to do that. We have a public that wants to trust the government, but has had a lot of broken breaches. And so we have this opportunity space. And the last lever of huge opportunity in the authorizing environment and in the public sector is the space of leadership. So about 1/3 of all public leaders in the public sector will retire in the next 5 to 10 years. So we basically have a leadership cliff of people leaving. And anytime there is, and I would say that data was based on pre-pandemic. So I think that number is actually accelerated and is higher post-pandemic based on what we sort of anecdotally see. The reality is we have a massive leadership shift. Who is going to run this space of low trust in democracy, but high opportunity, high need, but shrinking resource? There is a space here to do transformational work, and the space is currently being occupied by women of color or female identifying people of color. The public sector currently has the highest percentage based on job function of Black and Latinx women in middle management leadership positions, higher than the private sector, higher than higher education. There are more women, and particularly BIPOC women, leading middle management spaces in the public sector than in any of the other sectors combined. And so what we have are people in these positions already. We have civic change agents ready and willing to do the work. And we have a public sector that is ready for a generational moment of change if we can figure out how to lean into it. In addition, the reason the public sector is a compelling way for us to think about advancing justice work, and particularly through arts and culture, is that arts and culture exist and have always existed as sort of mechanisms and sort of opportunities in adjacencies, particularly in policy structures. So we often in this country default to thinking about the National Endowment for the Arts and its equivalent state and local arts agency partners as sort of the arts and culture system in the United States. And that could not be more false. We all know that in communities, arts and culture work is led, funded, and facilitated in many other systems in the country. In the last couple of years, we've seen a huge focus in public health agencies and working with arts and culture, thanks in no small part to the work led by Maria Rosario Jackson and the University of Florida, Jill Sankey and that team, who really, I think, tried to solidify the role of art and culture in sort of delivering systems level public health. We see an increasing opportunity, particularly now in the reauthorization of the Federal Workforce Act, in really classifying arts and culture workers within that system. And much of the creative placekeeping work that we've done over the last 15 years as a sector has really focused on infrastructure, from transit to public work, et cetera, and really thinking about arts and culture. And right now there's about a $50 million demonstration program tracking through the federal government right now to reimagine juvenile justice and particularly work with justice-involved families through arts and culture intervention. So the reality is there is a lot of resource and a lot of existing policy structures in these adjacent domains in which we may advance racial justice, in which arts and culture are positioned to be expanded. And so the report really centers the idea that it is possible, and we have a huge opportunity if we lean into the public sector, and that in terms of liberating resources and moving power to people, we have an incredible opportunity in the public sector if we seek to take it. One of the things that requires us to do is to imagine public policy structurally differently than we have. So those domains that we talked about earlier largely function in a way that the public sector allocates money from taxpayers, corporate or individual, and reallocates it typically in the form of grant of some sort, sometimes contract, to arts and culture organizations, which are a very small subset of communities, and particularly white-led cultural organizations. And it keeps a closed loop of policy structures and systems happening between a very small number of actors and players. In order for us to really reimagine public policy as a justice mechanism in this country, it requires us to recenter policy around humans and their full humanity, and the communities and systems in which they work, and to see those systems as integrated. This is a structure called Vital Conditions, which you can read more about at thriving.us. It's currently being used by the CDC and then the CDC and others to reimagine what does a whole systems approach look like to care in public policy. And in the middle of it is the idea that arts and culture unleash belonging and civic muscle, and they are at the center point of all of these other potentially policy structures and domains that operate when we look at communities. And so in this series, we're going to invite you to shift the mindset of arts and culture policy as a series of narrowly defined grants that go between largely nonprofit organizations and communities, and to imagine what arts and culture centered public policy might look like if it was centered around full humanity and full community understanding through a thriving-based model. Randy, do you want me to keep going or do you want to chat?
Yeah, well, I think it's one shorthand way of thinking about that is there is investment in cultural practice across a variety of opportunities that is for the purpose of creating art, storytelling, and narrative. There's also culture as an enabling strategy. There's arts as the how. There's a vehicle by which arts and culture helps young people stay engaged in education and find educational success, prepares them for a 21st century workforce. There's a way in which it can improve sort of social cohesion and community connection in neighborhoods. So I think it's that intersectional approach where cultural work is a strategy towards a greater public policy goal. And that's what those four examples Jen gave create an opportunity.
And in order for that to do, we're gonna practice over these next 8 weeks, both today and going forward, in a from-to sort of framework that we're gonna encourage you to open your mind up for imagination. And so specifically, if we're gonna do things that are around advancing racial justice, we first have to we have to center self-determination, we have to center wealth building, and we have to center power in all thoughts of how we're moving. And so, for example, if we're going to move to racially equitable arts and culture policy, we have to move away from a small number of people determining for example, the construct of how the budget works or the grant guidelines. And we're going to have to move towards the structures in our own policies that have participatory creation, participatory management, and participatory evaluation, in which the people actually who are receiving the policy are co-designers in the actual policy and its management and administration. And so that is a from-to that is going to be kind of earth-shattering for many local and state arts agencies to imagine, right? How do we move from these things that are often dictated to us, and we are the holders of those policies, into really things that are much more participatory? What does it mean to unwind those things? And so this from-to mental shifting is a way, we're going to practice that by sort of going through cases over the next couple of weeks. So the other thing that I think is important to talk about is, often when we talk about arts and culture policy, and this is often structured around, particularly when we talk about creative economy policy, the focus is often, we're going to make X investments and it is going to enrich who? It's not going to enrich an individual. It's not going to build their wealth or build their earning capacity or build the wealth of a particular neighborhood. Often a creative economy policy is around generating more tax-based income for the institution or municipality or community. So there is often a wealth creation that goes institution to institution versus individual, versus wealth that is created and held within individuals and then held and sort of self-determined within communities. And so a lot of our structures that we, everything from public art creation policy to investments in funding for creative practice in communities, often is around enriching a larger system rather than enriching individuals and communities. And so we're going to ask you to think about, what would it mean for your community, your program, the place of leadership that you're holding in your public agency, to really begin to shift that fundamental idea of power and wealth creation and wholeness from the system and the institution to the individual and the community.
One thing I would add is Noni Sessions described the 501c3 nonprofit model, Noni from EB Prec, as the backpack full of rocks. And I think one of the constraints that the nonprofit structure put on us is a scarcity mentality, an idea that there's only a limited amount of resources and therefore we must compete vigorously for those resources. And those who have professional grant writing staffs tend to win the grant writing contest that is the distribution of said resources. But that particularly gets tricky when you're talking about creative workers, creative businesses, creative industries versus nonprofit arts and cultural activities. But if we instead challenge that frame and say it's about both expanding the resources and the structural opportunities within and adjacent to cultural activity, then it isn't about a zero-sum game. It's about finding out ways to leverage more resources for more people so that each community has the means of cultural production on their own terms. And that's where some legislation like the Creative Economy Revitalization Act, which is in the Department of Labor right now, those opportunities invite us to think bigger and more strategically about what's possible and not be trapped in the limited thinking of the small resource pool that's available to us today. And so here's the question, right? the last slide is like the fundamental question of this whole series. What if we reimagine the underlying policy frames in most public agencies that center this reality? What if we have the from towards mentality? It has been this way, it could be this way. What are the steps along the way that allow us to think about a future wherein communities have the right of self-determination, they have the means of cultural production, they have the tools to build community wealth? We're going to hear some examples of that from case studies in a few minutes. But to tee that up, we were going to offer a few examples of from towards. And Jen, did you want to start off?
Sure. I mean, so one of the ones that I think has been top of mind for many of you here is that in most public agencies in the United States, state and local in particular, there has been some level of funding of artists, but often that is through a project-based grant. And then the artist is often time limited, specific, and doesn't really actually, it covers, materials and supplies. You have X artist project grant. And we've seen a move to actually go, rather than the project and the product, and effectively that's what the public agency is saying, which is they're saying, you artists are just a conduit to said product. You're going to create this festival, you're going to create this intervention, you're going to do this after school program, and we're going to pay you to do that product because that product is necessary to us as an agency. We've determined that that product is important. What we've seen more and more of are guaranteed basic income or artist support programs that really proliferated during the pandemic, where all of a sudden the pandemic happened and we decided maybe we should just pay artists to be artists because they need to be human. Right? And so we now have in many cities pilots happening where we are looking at guaranteed basic income programs that are untethered from a product, where the artist has to produce something that is specific and dictated by the protocols of the agency. So again, this is a policy thing that we should think about leaning into. What does it mean for us to shift public dollars to support artists, to be artists and to be creators in their community that may or may not be tethered to a specific output that is dictated by the institution? So what would that look like? How do we begin to imagine that? Randy, do you have another example?
Yeah, and I think most public agencies in the country have some form of 1% for art or public art ordinance. And traditionally, that ordinance is geographically limited to where the project happens, and by nexus rule, has to have a relationship to the work of the utility or the capital department, and tends to result in a site integrated work or a sculptural element that is installed at the conclusion of a capital project, which is not unto itself a bad thing, though often inequitable. We're seeing the emergence of projects that are more social and civic practice oriented, meaning that the deliverable of the project in many ways is how they engage with community and how they build support for an idea or a sense of shared outcome. And so that's one example of where public art dollars are being used a little bit differently, and we're engaging community on the front end instead of putting an installation or site integrated work on the back end. Additionally, we know that the public art field is very particular. City procurement, as any government person will tell you, is a harsh mistress. And so it can be difficult to navigate the barriers that exist within the field of public art. And so we're seeing an increase in capacity building programs that are helping artists through a public art program take their practice from the studio to the public realm. In Seattle, the Public Art Boot Camp was a great example of that. And there are others around the country where we're really trying to build the capacity of artists, particularly emerging and BIPOC artists, so that they can compete and provide their cultural vision and their narrative stories for their communities. So it's just an example of from towards, one being sort of a stayed model that we've had for a long time, and one being an emergent model that seems to be a little more responsive to community.
And just one last example, one of the major issues for individual artists, particularly in communities, is access to capital. So banks, even community development financial institutions, and even nonprofit lenders often work on a banking structure that requires you to have proof of regular income, something artists often don't have. They don't tend to have regular paychecks because their work is gig-based or itinerant, and that's the very nature of kind of creative and artistic work often. And so often artists are literally locked out of capital access, either in terms of small equipment loans to begin to expand their studios, et cetera. And so we see an increasing number of community development financial institutions, particularly those that are Black and Native led, really looking at character and trust-based lending and alternate credit scoring to really think about what does capital access look like for artists and other workers who are gig-based as they begin to think about what does holistic wealth look like, both for individuals and communities. So again, interrupting structures and interrupting the underlying premise of structures that have existed and held power and held wealth for a really long time, i.e. loan lending and loan access and loan feasibility, credit worthiness, really kind of beginning to unpack that. So we know that there are examples, and what we want to do now is actually shift to some of those examples. I'd like to introduce our first kind of guest speaker today. Cara Elliott Ortega is the Chief of Arts and Culture for the City of Boston. She is an urban planner that is focused, really has focused on the role of arts and creativity in the built environment and community development. Prior to becoming the Chief of Arts and Culture for the City of Boston, she served as the Director of Policy and Planning for the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture. And she works really to implement the Boston Creates, Boston's 10-year arts and culture plan. Cara's going to sort of tell us a little bit about the structure of their Artist in Residence program. I'm going to stop share so she can.
Great. Thank you so much. Hard to go first after that amazing intro. I'm going to share my screen here. Great. All right. Everyone good seeing my slide? Great. Okay. Thanks so much. So as Jen just said, I'm Cara Elliott Ortega. I'm the Chief of Arts and Culture for the City of Boston with the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture. And I'm coming to you right now from Roxbury in Boston on the land of the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about the Boston Artist in Residence program and just even hearing Randy and Jen just talk about all of these policy questions and issues. There's a lot of it packed in, I think, into what we've been doing in Boston. So I'm also just like thinking in real time about all of these overlaps. The Artist in Residence program in Boston is going into its 5th year. And it's a program where we match artists with city departments and different city initiatives to be in residence, but that residency is not to create artistic products, it's to co-design projects that really emerge from the relationship between the artists we're working with, the city staff we're working with, and Boston community members. And behind this program is kind of a core belief of our work that creativity is a requirement for imagining justice at any scale, including at City Hall. And that creativity and creative workers can make city policy more human-centered, more relational, and more equitable. And we call the practice of doing and facilitating that work civic practice. And the hope is that there are outcomes for all 3 of those groups that I just mentioned, the cultural practitioners, the city workers, and community members. And here's just a quick overview of what the cycle of this program looks like. We just recently started taking 2 full years to do this program. It's structured as a part-time job for the artists. We get artists and city departments to raise their hands and say that they want to do this. And we take on kind of the matchmaking, the relationship building, which is built in as a 3-month process. Both the artists and the city partners go through a curriculum, which includes unpacking what equity and racial equity mean in the city of Boston, how the city as an institution perpetuates harms and injustice, the breadth of what creative work can look like, especially in each of these different topic areas that artists are working in, and also a deep dive into each department's work. And here are our current artists and their partner departments. This group just launched about a month ago and is in that kind of relationship building phase. And the departments that they're working with in the city of Boston are the Boston Planning and Development Agency Research Division, the Planning Division, our Transportation Office, the Parks Department, the Environment Department, and then we have one artist for the first time this year who's going to be a participatory action researcher who's embedded in the program. And to share some examples of just like what this actually looks like and how this advances equity, I'm just going to show some kind of quick clips from different artists who we've worked with over the years. This is Erin Genia, who's a cultural organizer and worked with the Department of Emergency Management during the height of the pandemic. And as emergency management was working overtime on direct response, Erin really took a step back and asked what it would look like to understand emergencies as cultural emergencies beyond kind of immediate crisis to long-term strategies that really create health and safety for BIPOC communities. And Erin's work really centers indigeneity and really helps to catalyze a conversation across various departments at City Hall about gaps in our service of Indigenous communities. And there's now an interdepartmental working group that is taking concrete steps to address how the city actually serves our Indigenous population, looking at everything from the lack of Indigenous public health data to staffing a new role focused on Indigenous community engagement. This is Karen Young. Karen Young identifies as a cultural organizer. She's also a taiko drummer. She worked with our Age Strong office and a city community center on what started as a taiko drumming class for older adults, mostly Black women in our Grove Hall neighborhood. And through that class, the group decided to use their kind of newfound sense of agency and energy together to address a longstanding public safety issue. So the group, which still goes by the name Older and Bolder, became transportation advocates. So they kind of looked around their community and they saw that there was a crosswalk that was really unsafe. And we actually held a joint city and drumming and community protest to raise awareness of that issue around the crosswalk. And that got integrated into the capital plan for the city. And it's now a raised pedestrian crosswalk. This is Victor Yang, who's a community organizer and a writer, and he worked with the Boston Public Health Commission Violence Intervention and Prevention Program. And this was really a youth organizing project looking at issues of mental health and youth agency, especially during the pandemic. And the outcome of this was a campaign at a local high school where young people advocated for having 1 free hour block of time in their student schedule to really create space for mental health and rest. And they actually won that campaign at that one school. And now we're looking at trying to take it system-wide. So when it comes to what we've learned, there are some outcomes over the years that have become, I would say, clearer every year that we do this program, because it's definitely a bit of like a compost pile of different elements that we put together and try to like really see kind of what happens and what emerges every year. So we're constantly learning new things. Where we are building knowledge of city government for artists and communities. We are investing in a group of artists each year that really does strengthen our creative community, especially our BIPOC artists, both by supporting their kind of individual careers, but also growing a network of cultural workers and organizers who have experience with civic practice work, understand the city, and also want to go do things kind of outside of an institutional context. We're making space for the city to lean into what can feel like a risky sort of intangible process, especially for city departments and staff who are really used to kind of like the more technocratic project management. You're going from point A to point B. This process really disrupts that and asks city staff to take a lot of time to try things that don't have necessarily like that tangible win at the end of them. And we also saw that this program was a space for city staff to talk really openly amongst each other and with community members and the artists that we were working with about racial equity and equity issues, including the role that the city plays in creating inequities and creating equitable policies, but also the role that city staff as individuals play. And this program has become a bit of a safe space for city staff to meet like-minded city staff. And really have some kind of almost professional development opportunity themselves to talk about what it's like to be in that kind of bureaucratic institutional context, trying to do value-based work. And then lastly, we're seeing the beginnings of actions and policies and new networks that are making actionable changes based on the experience through this program. And there are some ongoing lessons for us as the local arts agency investing in this work. We tend to put a lot of expectation on artists. We can't really expect artists to come into a huge institution and just like solve big systemic issues, right? So that means that a lot of our work is really about the facilitation. It's about wraparound support. It's really making time and space for well-being and rest with artists, connecting artists to existing resources, whether that's affordable housing or childcare, and really also being super flexible about our own expectations of this kind of a program. And that facilitation is also its own skill set. And I think it's something that we don't necessarily think of or have included in like the training such that it is for being an arts administrator or for being city staff. So that's something that we're really explicit about in terms of understanding that skill set and seeing that as a part of the work. And I think lastly, there are equity outcomes for this program, but there's also a handoff here where the ideas really need to be codified and communicated and championed. And that's not necessarily the artist's job, but really our job in local government. And so Karen Young's kind of transportation advocacy project is a really good example of that, where they were able to get a win and get that crosswalk improved. But what the policy kind of implication of that is another question, which might look like handing over decisions for the next year's capital budget cycle to our Black and Brown seniors and communities most impacted by public safety. So we take that on ourselves to say, maybe that's the idea that really comes out of this program. And then what's our job in the arts office to really try to move that forward politically? So that's what that's part of why we've given ourselves a good 2 years to do this program and try to take a lot of space to have the work kind of on the front end and the follow-up to really advocate for whatever comes out of these projects, whether that's community investments or supporting the trajectory of the artist, which includes really being co-conspirators kind of outside of City Hall. And with that, I will stop there.
Cara Elliott Ortega is a legend. Thank you so much for sharing that. Cara's going to stick around for the Q&A. So if you have questions for Cara, you can ask them. You can put them in the chat now, or you can wait until the end. It's my distinct privilege to introduce our next guest. Matthew Richter was born in a small town. He is currently the interim director of the Cultural Space Agency, which you'll hear a lot more about in just a moment. He spent the last 7 or 8 years as the first cultural space liaison in the country at the Office of Arts and Culture in Seattle, and did a variety of work around preservation, activation, and creation of cultural spaces, looking at policy, looking at land use. And Matthew has been sort of a creator of cultural space and steward of cultural space and cultural space preservation for 30 years. He's someone I really am grateful I got to work with for many years in local government. And I can't wait for him to share with you the model that is the Cultural Space Agency. So Matthew, please take it away.
Thanks, Randy. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to share a dais with these folks. This is amazing and instructive. And yeah, thanks for having me here. So I have no slides until the end. I'll share some images of some projects right at the end. But Seattle's root problems really begin in the 1850s when these lands were stolen from the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and many other tribes. The Cultural Space Agency brings a reparative strategy to that harm that we'll talk about a little when we get to those projects, sort of where the rubber meets the road. Seattle's more contemporary problems really begin in the 1950s when we began a roughly 30-year period of negative growth rate. More people dying or moving away from Seattle than were being born or moving to Seattle until about 1980. The 70s are famously when a pair of real estate agents took out a billboard on Interstate 5 that said, "With the last person to leave Seattle, please turn out the lights." I saw that there's some Clevelanders represented in the list today, the home of the negative growth rate. So nice to see you here. That negative growth rate here depressed the real estate market and created these incredible opportunities for cultural communities to take inexpensive and enormous cultural spaces and establish some of the arts and cultural orgs that are going to define this city for the next couple of decades. Warehouses and old car dealerships and former manufacturing spaces became organizations like Black Arts West and Annex Theater and 911 Media Arts and COCA and dozens of these thriving community spaces. And then the growth rate turns around. And in the 80s and 90s and aughts, a wave of migration spreads over Seattle, driven by all the reasons, right? So with this positive growth rate comes the inevitable gentrification and displacement pressure as the markets pick up steam. Classic urban story repeated throughout the country. Popularity that communities of color create in culturally rich neighborhoods gets exploited. Those same communities are pushed further and further away from their neighborhoods and away from opportunity generally. And then in 2010, the growth rate goes into overdrive. The graph line just hockey sticks, and we enter into this decade where we were famously America's fastest growing city, right? And at its peak, a person moved to Seattle every 17 minutes around the clock, year long. And that same year, we built housing faster than we'd ever built it before. We created a housing unit every 140 minutes. So just the math of those two numbers, a person moves here every 17 minutes, we build a new housing unit every 140 minutes, create some of the country's strongest displacement pressures and one of its worst affordability crises. And it's into this emerging crisis that the city of Seattle becomes the first city in the US to invest in a body of work around cultural space, a full-time employee, which was me, and a 6-figure budget to go out and find out what's wrong, and why are cultural spaces disappearing and not being replaced, and to try and fix it. One of the first projects we launched was an inventory, the Cultural Space Inventory, where we cataloged about 800 cultural spaces in Seattle. Australia, you could drop Randy just dropped it, the Space Lab Northwest link. What we found through this study was that in a city that's about 70% white, that white cultural spaces were more than just the norm. They were 94% of the space in that inventory. That means that 30% of our city was reflected through only 6% of its cultural space, which is as deep a disproportionality as we saw in any metric connected to arts and culture in Seattle. So it's in the control of cultural space specifically that we saw the deepest disconnects in racial representation. So the work that we developed really looked to that 6% number as the very specific needle that we wanted to move. We developed a long list of projects and programs, and about 3 years later, we published a report called the CAP Report, 30 Ideas for the Creation, Activation, and Preservation of Cultural Space, which again, someone can drop a link in for. There were 2 ideas that I want to talk about that were in it, because they're connected to each other. The first was idea number 2, to certify people in the sort of nuanced expertise that we were developing at this intersection of cultural development and commercial real estate development. So we created a program called Build Art Space Equitably, or BASE, B-A-S-E, the BASE program. And now for the last 4 years, we've led an annual cohort of about 20 people through a curriculum that explores that cultural space intersection. We tried to bring in equal numbers of folks from the arts and culture world and from the commercial real estate world. And each year we'd graduate another 20 people, all people of color, with some expertise about equitable cultural space development. And it's this group of graduates and of cohort members that becomes the working group to explore another idea in that 30 idea list. Idea number 24 was create a cultural space management and development entity. And this becomes, after 3 years of development and community engagement, design, redesign, the Cultural Space Agency. So, the Cultural Space Agency is a mission-driven real estate development company. We create opportunities for wealth building in communities of color using cultural space, which we define very broadly as the investment mechanism. We are a city-chartered private corporation. It's a corporate form called a Public Development Authority in the state of Washington. They exist in other states under different names. And we operate very much like a nonprofit. And every now and then we get one of the benefits of being a little more closely connected to government than your average nonprofit is. We elevated the graduates of this BASE program, this learning cohort, to be the core leadership group of the organization, which we call the constituency. And the constituency does 3 things primarily. They vet property investment opportunities and programming partnership opportunities, and they recommend projects and partnerships to move forward in our pipeline. They create the ground rules by which the organization operates. They write the mission, values, policies, vision for the whole organization. And they nominate the board of directors, called a governing council in our corporate form, but they nominate the governing council / board of directors, which is then approved by city council and the mayor's office. And so this constituency isn't tasked with being a governing body. We do have a board that governs, but they are really considered to be the sort of core leadership and the piece of the organization that roots us most deeply to the communities that we are designed to serve. I should also say I'm an interim director. I'm here to steward the stand-up of the organization, the creation of these internal systems, and get some first projects across the line. We're hiring permanent staff this year. So this organization partners with community-based cultural organizations to acquire or to take long-term control over cultural real estate. In the past 18 months, we've raised $17.2 million with our partners. And this year we're going to be landing 50,000 square feet of cultural space into community hands. Our role is to manage the real estate development and the ownership and to allow the partner organization to do their thing without being distracted by the real estate management, but also without having to worry about displacement or without having to worry about the future, being able to anchor. Our role is also to ultimately get out of these deals, to cede our portion of the ownership to the community organization over time, and to build capacity there for them to fully own and to fully manage that space on their own. That might happen in 5 years, might happen in 50 years, it might never happen, and that's fine with us. We're there to be a patient partner and to move out on the partner organization's timeline. To answer one of the prompts that was put to all the speakers, what have we learned in this? Maybe we'll come back to this at the end if there's a minute, but we have learned very recently that we are a catalyst for growth and we are a catalyst for change. And we work with a friend of mine named Prentice Oniyami in Portland, who said recently that catalytic reactions generate heat and that enough heat will crack the beaker. And what we've learned recently is that we need to be in a position to support these partner organizations as we increase the stress on them, maybe unintentionally, but we need to help hold them together as we raise that heat. So I'll describe a couple of projects now, and I will now screen share to show you some imagery. These are just a couple slides that I grabbed out of various decks, but I just want to show you some pictures of what we're talking about as I walk through them. These are a couple of projects that have recently moved in the pipeline. Can I just get a thumbs up from Randy or Jen, who I can see that you're seeing this? So this is the Columbia City Theater.
Matthew, we can see your screen. You might want to put it in presentation mode.
Right. So you can't see my other screen. This is the Columbia City Theater. It's a 1923 vaudeville house that we acquired about 2 weeks ago for $3.2 million in partnership with a group called Rainier Avenue Radio. When I say partnership, that means that we, together with the community organization, with Rainier Ave Radio in this case, we co-own an LLC, just sort of a drop down from our public development authority. And that LLC now owns the property. It's programmed as the home of a Black-owned community-based internet radio station and as a nightlife and community events venue and as a career-connected learning program teaching kids the skills related to all of that programming, right? To broadcast, to production, to writing, editing, event production, marketing, all of it. It's a beautiful space. There's the showroom, the studio in back, and at the bottom right there, the sort of front facade to the street. Another project, so this is an acquisition that we made about a month ago, maybe 5 weeks ago. This is a project that we call El Barrio. This is 32,000 square feet. It's a half a block in the deeply Latin neighborhood of Seattle called South Park. It includes a music hall from the 1920s, a 15,000 square foot surface parking lot that's a development opportunity. It's a $5.8 million acquisition that we made with a group called Cultivate South Park. We're going to support community events in the parking lot, a weekly market, pop-up vendor fairs, music nights, quinceañeras, etc. The South Park Hall is the 1920s music hall venue, the South Park Idea Lab, that's a co-working space for nonprofits, and 5 neighborhood-owned small business spaces around the property as well. This is a ground floor commercial condo acquisition. So we're buying out the ground floor in a new affordable housing project, 200 units of affordable housing. And on the ground floor, we're going to put these 2 Afro-diasporic dance organizations, Northwest Tap Connection and the Union Cultural Center, which teaches capoeira dance. It's about a 10,000 foot floor plate. We are buying it for $3.5 million from the nonprofit Lytec housing developer who's developing the whole project. Between the 2 organizations, Northwest Tap and Union Cultural Center, they've been displaced from 5 different spaces, have had to rebuild themselves 5 different times. This is a project called Station Space. We're taking the 2nd floor of the King Street Station, the old 1906, I think, train station in Pioneer Square, and developing it as a youth-serving, what I'm calling an empowerment lab. We're taking 5 youth-serving nonprofits, Totem Star, which started as an organization with putting formerly incarcerated youth in a recording studio. Red Eagle Soaring, which works with Indigenous youth, urban Indian youth, teaching theater skills and filmmaking skills, and creating a shared venue in the train station. Inscape is a project in the pipeline that, and this we've funded and breaks ground this fall, the Station Space one. Inscape, that's an old INS building that's currently 110 artist studios and small businesses and a theater space. And we are working with a nonprofit that they have formed called Friends of Inscape. That's the tenants organization to acquire that building. We're still building the capital stack for this one. This one's not across the finish line yet, but we hope to land this in the next year. This is a project that we're so far just calling the Indigenous Campus. This is an 8-acre parcel in North Seattle that the city, together with a nonprofit, is buying to develop into affordable housing. And with the housing office, we're developing a plan for the space agency to have first right of refusal on acquiring the ground floors of the 8 different buildings that'll happen on this campus, all of which will combine to create an indigenous, fully owned cultural campus. And so one space might be specifically aimed towards gathering and celebration and performance. One space might be specifically aimed at culinary tradition and food sovereignty and farming and gardening. One space might be about craft work and visual arts and exhibition. And we're working with a broad base of indigenous organizations, both from within our constituency and partners in Seattle, to develop this idea more fully. And that's I'm going to stop there because that's the very quick breeze through the organization and its projects. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Very exciting.
It's super exciting. And I think with all of these, you begin to see these policy structures that are possible when we think about power and resource and self-determination as the underpinning. So our next guest really, I think, needs very little introduction. He is the TO of all things arts, culture, and racial equity. But Roberto Bedoya is the 2021 Beresford Prize winner. He is a writer, activist, and policymaker, and currently the cultural affairs manager of the city of Oakland. Prior to that, he ran the Tucson Pima Arts Council and a bazillion other million things that he has done to advance racial justice and the lives of artists and places and culture and belonging in the United States. And so Roberto's going to talk a little bit about cultural plans. Roberto.
Roberto, you're on mute.
And I was just thanking you. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everybody on this call, GIA, and my colleagues. It's been so much and so rich, and a couple of things before I start to kind of share stories related to the cultural plan, which is really kind of in the foreground of what I want to talk about today, Oakland's cultural plan. But Jen and Randy, that overview was fabulous. And I could argue with you about many of those little points. But I think that one of the things that I'm very mindful of, that in culture policy, culture is fluid, and policy aims to regulate through rules and regulations. So you have the two dynamics. You have one that's about fixing and one that's always about opening out. So as an arts leader, you need to figure out how to work with those dynamics. And I share that story with you because obviously, when I started my job in Oakland, I was given the opportunity to do a cultural plan. And so I was very mindful of those dynamics. So what I want to do right now is just read a couple of paragraphs from of the plan, and it's on my screen, so forgive me if I'm a little clumsy here. And then I'll talk a little bit about where the plan has unfolded. The plan was created, almost 5 years ago. So the tagline for the plan was, I'm going to start reading here. Let me see if I can get this. The tagline of the plan is, equity is the driving force, culture is the frame, belonging is the goal, which operates as the guide on how we develop the plan. We focus on how Oaklanders realize their expressive life. Oakland's expressive life is remarkable and vigorous. It is where aesthetic voices, community voices, and the social imaginary of how we live together inform the value and belief in our public good and a robust democracy. The plan provides an overview of today's Oakland. This is written 5 years ago, so again. And the planning process offers a vision of culture for the city and suggest pathways to lift up the role of culture in building a just and equitable city. It is not a document that operates as a typical strategic plan or SWOT analysis that cages itself in a technocratic assessment of the Cultural Affairs Division. It is a narrative that offers up a different lens and a different approach to understanding our city and how an alignment of culture and equity is required for Oaklanders to realize their potential. We listened to the many stories of experiences. Oh, excuse me, I just lost this text. Hold on. Anyway, let me just start right here. I often think about how imagination and policy influence each other, whether it's culture or public policy or the imagination of an individual or a group. As a cultural affairs manager, my work with artists, communities, and elected officials engages me with the entanglements of will at play in civil society. There's public will, political will, and poetic will, which functions as the wind behind the actions of policy making and imagination. Given that the policy aims to fix via management guidelines and rules, and culture is fluid, as it develops new knowledge and brings to life our possibility, how do we work with these forces? We know that policy should follow meaning. What the plan is what the plan has realized is that Oaklanders have deep meaning of in being alive in an equitable society. I mean, I'm the home of the Black Panthers. I'm the home of the environmental movement and disability movement. In many ways, this legacy of my city around cultural activism is deep. And to that end, the plan's orientation to equity and culture feeds an action agenda, a behavior shift that sees cultural affairs, my division, embrace of connectiveness and intersectionality as key to realizing belonging. The work of the Cultural Affairs Division is presented in the document is to serve as civic narrative of belonging in all its beauties, temperaments, and complexities. So I'm going to stop there, and I did a mumble job. You guys can roll with me. But I think what the plan generated and where I'm really happy with is this notion that we're trying to assert a civic narrative of belonging. Right now it's election season. Our mayor is going to be up for election in November. And in these town hall meetings, people are asking our electeds, what is your belonging strategy? So I talk about in City Hall context, if City Hall has a transportation strategy, a housing strategy, a workforce development strategy, it needs to have a belonging strategy. And then I look at my colleagues in City Hall, and cultural affairs, parks and recs, and libraries, we are the three agencies that deliver belonging in a city. Now, so that's where the intersectionality work begins. But also the fact that we have this civic narrative, and now everybody talks about belonging in my town, and it's a sticky word because everybody wants to belong. I'm very mindful also that when I talk about belonging, I'm talking about the sociology of belonging and not necessarily the psychology, and they are related. But in the government context, we need to look at belonging and disbelonging, redlining, and zoning laws. And I mean, Matthew, I had so much envy over all your space mumbo jumbo because as the marijuana industry grows in Oakland and artists get displaced from the studio, we don't have a policy around space issues. So that's kind of action of disbelonging. And I guess I'll just rambling on here a little bit of things about what we produce as a result of the plan and how we operationalize belonging in my context. First of all, we form partnerships. Well, let me back up a little. We pivoted our support of individuals, and artists, and organizational projects to foreground neighborhood and social cohesion. Mindful of the fact that, you know, belonging is also understanding what is understanding your neighborhood, understanding social cohesion, understanding civic well-being, and those connections that really kind of enliven a locale. So that was one way we do that. And the other one was we established, very like Hara, a very robust what we call cultural strategies and government program. We did a pilot round that we did. We had 6 artists and residents in various departments, and it sort of, the pandemic came and then sort of went and ended on a weird muddle note, but everything ended on a weird muddle note. I think we're still in a weird muddle note, but I'm about ready to launch another round where I'm working with 11 departments on cultural strategy. And again, the objective is to help these departments work with culture strategists, artists, cultural gatekeepers, cultural stewards, a variety of cultural workers on their belonging strategy. So in some ways, I keep foregrounding belonging. And then the last thing, we form partnerships with the Community Foundation and Akanadi Foundation, which is a social justice foundation, to fund what we call the Just City Initiative, which supports artists of color who deal with racial justice in the foreground. So that was really down and dirty, man. You know me, I gotta probably bounce around a little bit. But I guess one last comment. Being inside government and in the afterwake of George Floyd, and just recalling these conversations I had with my city administrator, and there was, you know, all this wonderful murals on Broadway, which is the main downtown thoroughfare, came up, and all these visual DIY murals around this moment in time. And, you know, he was like, we were talking, I said, you know what, Ed, his name is Ed. I said, you know, Ed, this is like where we need to get government out of the way. And don't get in the way what this is. So there's 2 things. There's governance and there's government. And people want government, but they don't want government. They don't like us, but they want government. They call me up and they'll say, they think I'm the ATM machine or God, and both, with their query. But anyway, the beauty of the cultural plan is that we've got what I like to call the political will, public will, and poetic will all at play in trying to insert this as a policy, strategy, and tactic.
Thank you,
And a story.
Roberto. Never the story, because imagination, you know, I think what we're trying to do in this series and in highlighting these 3 examples is talk about the way in which policy has operationalized injustice. But all of these 3 examples talk about the capacity of policy to operationalize belonging, self-determination, and power shifting. It is possible to begin to do that, and it is possible to begin to do that as stewards within the public sector. And it's not just possible, it's critically necessary. And so, you know, we hope that in the invitation to all of you listening today is to kind of go through the series and through this case making and learning and examples, begin to think about the capacity of civic imagination to do things quite differently and to undo these unjust structures, simultaneous to that is to begin to build the power with each other as leaders and collaborators and co-conspirators, so that we can do that. And that's really the intent of the Cultural Policy Learning Series and the cohort that will go alongside of this. I know that we have a handful of questions that Estrella has been lovingly moderating in Q&A that I think we want to turn to. But Randy, before we do that, if there's any kind of other summary that you wanted to offer before we pivoted to Q&A.
Oh, just that I think that the model from Boston really offers a great intersectional systems change approach that brings these cultural strategists, these artists in residence, into other areas of government to improve and transform their work. I think the Cultural Space Agency really does a great job of talking about community wealth building through a policy and systems approach. And Belonging in Oakland is really about self-determination. It's really a framework by which, in a variety of platforms, the residents, the cultural workers, the creatives of Oakland can advance self-determination and foster belonging in their community. And so it's these sort of themes of more equitable policy practice that are offered through these examples that we really thought they would bring those ideas to life. And all of them are here to be with you in the Q&A, and all of you are welcome to put any questions you have in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer it and have a little conversation for the next half hour or so. And Roberto's already got a question, and there was a couple in the Q&A that were ahead of Roberto.
I actually have a comment because it kind of goes back to Jen's wonderful introduction and this conversation about power. And I really want to share what I've learned from working in my community. And Randy uses the power of self-determination, which is a strong value. But there are three definitions of power that I'm mindful of. There's power building, which is kind of a term used many by cultural activist types who are working in community. There's power sharing, which is what they ask from me and what my philanthropic people who are more institutional. And then there's the power of self-determination, which is standing in one's own power. So I share that with you to sort of say that often when you're in community conversations, to be mindful of those three meanings of power that come into play, and not just sort of think like, oh, because I'm government, my job in many ways is about power sharing, and anyway, that's a comment.
Thank you, Roberto. We have a question from Gina Rodriguez-Drix from Rhode Island, who has a question for Cara. And the question is, I would love to know how Cara approaches other city departments to get their holistic participation prior to embedding an artist. We have a similar program in Providence at a smaller scale, and I found working interdepartmentally to be a place of most challenge.
Yeah, we also find that to be very challenging. Something that we have started to do, I think when we started the program, we just weren't as strong in our kind of position with it, and what we were like, what that real core kind of belief was, and what the value of it was to others. I think we were still a little bit tentative and kind of like, is anyone going to play in the sandbox with us? And over the years, I think we've just gotten a lot more direct and been really clear in saying that this is actually a resource to your department. This will help you accomplish at least what you say your goals are on paper. And it's a professional development opportunity. And we've been able to also, I think, on the other kind of more political side of things, really like buff up those wins so that they're extra shiny for leadership. And so it's kind of like working, I think, both sides, kind of from the more lateral staff to staff side, and then also really making sure that there is that kind of political piece as well, and understanding all of our roles in doing that. We also, this program started as an NEA grant and then was put onto our regular operating budget, and which is still kind of crazy to me that we were able to do that. But part of what that means is that we can rely on it every year. And so we spend the entire year like trying to find, like recruiting people for this program basically, and finding those people who might be kind of in middle management, or have been through a transition or are newer, some of those people who like we want to see in city government 10 years from now, and really kind of bringing them along and saying like, this is something that where we can really invest in your work as well, and where you're going to have a more fulfilling experience. So it's been something that we try to work across various levels in city government to create the demand for it. And then when we put out an application, it is actually pretty competitive from different city departments who now really want that resource.
Thank you, Kara. We're also going to be, we also have one of our sessions that is really exploring the artists in residence in more depth. So I think there's an opportunity for us to think about that kind of soft power and sort of facilitation between departments in several of the other sessions. But Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to read Sarah's question from the chat. Does anyone know if those UBI pilots and shifts to artist relief funding programs have stuck or even expanded as the pandemic continues, or have some of them phased out? Is anyone doing this research?
Yeah, so I think that the two largest pilots for artist-specific UBI and GBI are happening in San Francisco and in Twin Cities. They're both being administered by nonprofit collaborative partners who are facilitating administration, but they're actually ongoing, and both actually are being evaluated. So the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts is studying the City of San Francisco pilot, and in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Springboard is actually studying that. The other place, if folks are not used to, and I do see interest in this, I think that the mayor's initiative for guaranteed basic income is probably the single largest initiative in the United States, kind of looking at it from city pass-through dollars in terms of GBI and UBI. And we can put some of those additional information and resources to those of you considering guaranteed basic income. The other place where I'm sort of beginning to see a review of this is in workforce development, and some of the workforce development strategy and policy that's shifting to really begin to understand income and how artists are classified as workers, which begins to get to not just revenue and income, but also other worker protections that tend to be given to hourly wage workers or salaried workers with full-time jobs. So I think there's an incredible amount of initiative right now studying kind of just basic labor structures around artists and cultural work that is very much continuing. So I know that we are very near time and wanted to give Randy last word in kind of wrapping up and kind of thinking about where we go next.
Thanks, Jen. And I think we have time for one more question, I think, and I'm going to pass that off to Roberto. But then we can probably close for the day. I did just want to add one other model. There is a lot of interesting policy work happening with workforce and UBI and GBI. There's also, I think, the Creatives Rebuild New York is a really interesting model that also brings in philanthropy. And I think particularly for the GIA ecology, we have funders like Rainin and Mellon and Hewlett that are interested in this like policy advocacy space, and Creatives Rebuild New York to me is one interesting example of that. UBI is one subset of the kind of work that's happening both within Creatives Rebuild New York and in this sort of response work in general. But I think there's a lot of interesting emerging models. I'd also it's not a UBI model, but the California Creative Corps is about to also, shout out to Julie Baker, who I saw in the chat earlier. That's another model that's I think worth tracking. To Kara's point, I think this has been a great time of experimentation, and people are trying a lot of different things. And I think it's too early to know what's going to stick, but I would offer that things like artists in residence and creative strategists started that way, and now they're very prominent approaches coast to coast in large and small communities. Roberto, the last question on here that I wanted to bring to you is from an anonymous person in the audience. With your suggestion of government getting out of public art, specifically murals, getting out of the way, I think they meant, do you have any specific ideas on how to do so when a lot of street art, graffiti, and murals are non-sanctioned?
It's a good question. my struggle is that I validate DIY forms of a cultural expressions. It could be an underground rock and roll club. It could be a mural, and in some ways, I just am mindful of that spirit. Now, where I say have government get out of the way is that sometimes I'll tell the permit department, just hold off, man. Can you just relax? And then we'll just slow it down. Now, that's kind of me sort of like not asserting my power to maybe shut it down. But I also need to be mindful, like I got a bunch of I got some new money from a neighborhood murals program, which I'm really eager to launch. So in some ways, that becomes very neighborhood centric, and it allows me to do murals on facades that are not necessary public buildings. So it's like the neighborhood grocery store wants to do a mural. They could come to me and they can seek some resources. So but I also want to I was being a little bit of a joke about getting out of the way, but really sometimes I need to understand the governance is already in place in a locale and assert that into the government context. That this neighborhood watch group has already figured out how to deal with graffiti and how to deal with homelessness or whatever it may be. And they already have kind of a way in which they want to move and address this problem. And sometimes I need to say to my colleagues in City Hall, let's not get in the way. It's working.
Yeah.
So, that's
I mean, the only other thing I
strategy.
about that particular example is that, and it gets at this intersection of like the example that Kara brought about soft power between departments. For those of you who are kind of working in a city or state government structure, is that murals are a beautiful example. Murals intersect in every single domain I can think about in the public sector, right? They exist in public works, they exist in transit, they exist in planning and zoning, and they're a beautiful example if you unwind power and who has it and who's making it, to really sort of begin to think about how you educate those who might not know about that, how you as public officials can kind of can either, to Roberto's point, get out of the way or educate. I can remember myself being in many, many rooms about the difference between art and signage with the Planning and Zoning Board in the city of Nashville when I held that job, and really encouraging people to not imagine something as a sign, but imagine it as a piece of artwork. And this gets to the point of why these spaces are so important and what we hope the promise of the Cultural Policy Action Lab and Learning Series is, which is you all on this call have those places of positional power. Most of you. You are potentially in cities, you are in states, you are in public meetings. This is where we think this changes. It changes by this level of advocacy. It changes by us focusing on those structures, and it changes by us focusing on kind of liberating resources and power. And so we're really hopeful that this kind of conversation continues, and this community building that is happening in the chat even is kind of an outcome of this work together. So I'm going to thank our presenters and pass it off to Randy for the final word.
Thank you, Jen. First, the response to that last question, earlier when we were talking about public policy, what the government chooses to do or not to do, as someone who lived through the Capitol Hill Occupied protest, where it turns out lots of laws are, loose, vague. While government does choose to do things, government can also choose not to do things. And that's where you get things like a naturally occurring cultural district, or you allow the work to take root on its own terms, which is an interesting strategy. I want to thank Roberto and Kara and Matthew for giving us your time and for sharing your brilliance. You're all super inspiring. I want to thank Sherilyn and Steve from the GIA team, and Nadia and Eddie, wherever you may be. And Jen and Estrella, intrepid partners and collaborators on this work. Thank all of you for sticking with us through a very bumpy initial tech run. We learned some stuff. I learned about hotel internet, for example. We're glad we got through it. We're really happy to be beginning this journey with you. Estrella put in the chat the links to the next lab, which will be on June 22nd, hosted by Grantmakers in the Arts and National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, plus some additional case study guests. And you know, we hope that you'll register. There won't be a password next time. Another learning curve, things we're learning along the way. We'll work the bugs out, we'll work the kinks out, and we'll keep doing this work together. But our goal is really to build a community of practice and to build an intentional space where we all can learn from each other and do this work. So thank you so much for giving us a few hours of your day, and we hope to see you in a couple weeks.